perfect mix.
Hey, great mix. Okay. With that, let me introduce actually our new director for the Center for Urban Transportation Research. Jason Bittner has previously worked as Deputy Director of the National Center for Freight and Infrastructure Research and Education, CFIRE, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's served as the principal investigator or co-principal investigator for over 1.8 million in sponsored research in maintenance, quality assurance, freight transportation, and mobility concerns since 2008, and has published numerous articles in the Transportation Research Board as well as other journals. He's helped establish the Mid-America Freight Coalition, a 10-state partnership advancing freight planning and operations in the Midwest region, and has over 14 years' experience working with multi-state coalitions and regional entities on transportation topics. Mr. Bittner is a member of the TRB Committee on Transportation Asset Management and co-chair of the TRB Committee on Conduct of Research. He's also a member of the Executive Committee for the American Society of Public Administration section on Transportation Policy Analysis. And with that, let me turn it over to Jason. Jason?
Excellent. Thanks, Phil. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webcast. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm looking forward to some of the dialogue. I was pleased to see that there is a good mix of experiences and involvement in freight. So I'm looking forward to providing an overview for those of you who are actively engaged. Hopefully I'll provide enough specifics that you find this useful as well. Over the past decade, efficient freight transportation rose to the top of many executives' priority lists. In the quest for economic development, coupled with growth in international trade, transportation agencies need to modify business as usual approaches to transportation investment. Freight does not vote. Freight is also inherently a private sector focused activity. As such, the traditional model for public sector stewardship of transportation infrastructure faces new challenges and new opportunities. On average, just to give you some perspective, almost 11,000 ton miles of freight is transported annually for every single person in the United States. That would be equivalent of 1 ton of freight transported about halfway around the world for every person in the United States. Maximizing the efficiency of freight transportation is a key to minimize supply chain costs and the total cost to society. In general, over half of logistics costs are related to transportation, and speed and reliability are the key factors. Efficiency of freight transport has important implications for our economy's purpose and performance, and that's really the sort of foundation for what I hope to cover today. Starting out, though, before we get started, I want to take a moment to recognize that it's an important National Recognition Week. For those of you who don't know, this week is National Bike to Work Week, culminating in Friday's Bike to Work Day. Since we're focused on freight today, I figured I'd share some interesting approaches to moving freight via bicycle. I want to just outline that, the rest of the world seems to be ahead of the U.S. in this endeavor. In Brazil, they're starting from clockwise in the upper left. That's a fishmonger's bike, moving fresh fish products directly to market. Moving clockwise again, in London, the Office Depot electric assist bicycle provides for door-to-door delivery in London by bike, and a furniture mover in Chicago or in China is on the lower left-hand picture. Finally, we do have some examples in the United States. In Portland, often described as the bike mecca of the United States, the Beeline delivery service is moving more than just traditional parcels like bike couriers have served for years. But the cream of the crop in my book is this cargo bike here, set up with a portable brewery and a moving keg. So those of you who are bikers, that's what you could aspire to, have a portable bar as pedaled traffic. And it's certainly the movement of freight. By overview for today's presentation, I'd like to take the opportunity to sort of tell you what I hope to cover in the next 30 minutes or so. I'll tailor it a little bit to our audience, some of that basic public sector role, telling the freight story and some example cases, describing how we do want to integrate freight into transportation decision making. I'll touch briefly on land use and recognize its importance in moving freight forward. And then finally, I'll wrap up with some recommendations focused on organizational structure, an approach to economic development issues, and then describing some improvements to overall freight efficiency. I wish, of course, that I'd be able to guarantee that I can provide you with an implementable course of action at the end, but by providing some of my recommendations, perhaps we can see how it can be implemented in your own organization and move along that path. Since so many of you said, you could recognize what a truck looks like, what a barge looks like, and what a train looks like, but need to understand how that impacts what you do. I hope to provide some of that information. The most critical question in my mind, as far as considering the role of the public sector in freight, is why? Why do we even need to consider freight? I'll argue first, it is truly the economy in motion. It is the lifeblood of that economy. Over 60 million tons moved daily. That equates to roughly $40 billion in goods. And trade, international trade, is increasing as a share of our gross domestic product. Over the past 40 years, that international trade amount has grown from about 10% of our GDP to 30% of our GDP. From a jobs perspective, the handling and processing of freight and intermediate goods equal high-paying job opportunities, and in today's climate, the jobs, jobs, jobs mantra of public sector investment is critical. Dealing with congestion and capacity, truck traffic conservatively grows, and even with that conservative factor, we'll see increases in the range of 50 to 75%, nearly a doubling of the number of trucks that are currently on the highway system. If the public sector does not get involved in the movement of freight, we can see that congestion resulting in more vehicles on our infrastructure, and with a limited ability to manage that, essentially choking that ability of our economy in motion to actually operate. In the public sector, virtually all truck routes are owned by state or local governments. Airports and harbors are typically owned by public authorities. Air and water navigation is typically handled at the federal level, and safety is regulated by all levels of government. As a consequence of this mixed ownership and management, most solutions to freight problems require joint action by both public and private sector folks. Financial planning and other institutional mechanisms for developing and implementing joint efforts have been limited in the past, essentially inhibiting effective measures to improve the performance and minimize the public costs of our transportation system. In 2006, just to give you some sort of parameters here, the private sector owns about $985 billion in transportation equipment, plus another $558 billion in transportation-focused structures. The public sector owns about half as much in equipment, about $487 billion, and $2.4 trillion investment in highways. So understanding the coordination between freight interests and the public sector owner and operators of the transportation systems is increasingly important, especially as it relates to water and truck modes. From an efficiency perspective, the public sector needs to be involved because this is a social good. There is public value on improving the time that it takes to move around a society, as well as the limited resources that are available and that opportunity cost of transportation investments. Today's system, unfortunately, includes many deadhead miles or empty trips and inefficient and ineffective backhauls as goods are moved into an area. Many of us have heard of the impact of environmental concerns, especially as it relates to air quality and greenhouse gas emissions that are related to the movement of freight and diesel engines. And the final thing that is important for us to consider is the absolute power of freight corridors. The investment of public sector resources in developing solid freight corridors, and as not only a jobs endeavor, but a clearly well-defined public policy process is important, preserving and protecting freight corridors. In 2010, a survey was conducted through the National Cooperative Freight Research Program, and their survey respondents that represented both the public sector transportation agency officials and private sector freight stakeholders identified that the public sector had an inadequate understanding of freight movement in general and business drivers that really underpinned much of the freight movement in this country. So as that survey noted, there is a limited amount of information and knowledge in the public sector. So before we move into the rest of the presentation, I just want to briefly outline an understanding of supply chains and why they're important for freight movements. Supply chains have a clear spatial and geographic dimension. Activity hubs and links between the hubs are served by the transportation network. Their scope, however, local, regional, national, international in nature, has no respect for political jurisdictions. And this is a challenge in and of itself to our traditional transportation planning and policy. The system needs to link these diverse locations and functions at many stages throughout the production process, from a raw material, either imported or exported or extracted, through various stages of production, warehousing and distribution, and ultimately retail. A fundamental understanding is the recognition that the supply chain is a geographic base operation. There are very limited examples in this country of areas where final production is at the exact same location as raw material extraction. Oftentimes, market locations are very, very diverse and require many stops along the supply. Resources, however, do exist for preparing the public sector as far as its understanding of supply chains go. So this graph is from NCFRP's Envision Freight effort. It illustrates the vital link that is performed by freight transportation and supply chains and that relationship to economic performance. Improvements in transportation efficiency, reliability, and level of service have numerous economic benefits for production efficiency, optimization of distribution networks, and product choice and cost to consumers. Right now, from a perspective of total logistics costs, they represent 8% of the gross domestic product. If there are improvements in the system and you can lower that percentage, the cost of inventory can be reduced as needed hedges against transportation uncertainty is improved. This also allows firms to change their inventories quickly in response to customers' changing needs or desires, ultimately leading to lower costs and greater product variety for consumers. With that basic understanding of public and private interactions in the freight arena, it's also important just basically to tell a freight story. Where have we been, and basically asking, how did we get here? Most importantly, where can we expect to go? So there are several factors that have gotten us to where we're at now, and I really enjoy the use of the colorful term freight tsunami to demonstrate what we're looking at. As a complete tidal wave or tremendous change in population growth and technology, we see more and more freight movements on a larger scale. Based on middle series projections in the United States alone, by 2050, we'll see a 50% increase in our population from 1990. As consumption grows to serve those 392 million people, we see more need to have products in our supermarkets on the store shelves, and in order to supply the funds necessary to purchase those products, you need to have an active manufacturing and distribution system behind it. Product cycles have shortened. The average product life in manufacturing has been reduced. Consumers are likely to purchase more of an item and also keep it for a shorter period of time for many consumer goods. This freight tsunami is fueled by technology, just-in-time logistics practices, and pull logistics. Just-in-time manufacturing processes rely on using the transportation system, in essence, as a moving warehouse. And pull logistics allows a retail facility to keep fewer items on hand. International trade and globalization, as many more products are produced in a barrier-free, a border-free environment, you see more moves of products and services that really recognize no limitation and might move on many modes or many routes. A product, for instance, such as granite, which is mined in northern Minnesota, may be put on a rail line and exported to China for final processing, put into a container, shipped back across the United States into a port in Los Angeles and Long Beach, put back on a rail, moved to Chicago, trucked to Minneapolis to be put in the Minneapolis Home Depot market. It's truly a global nature of goods and services, and because transportation costs have been relatively cheap in the past, that type of movement is possible. Freight efficiency, however, certainly depends on the policies that we put in place to guide it. I want to address some of the freight considerations for those of you who are newer to freight in the audience. I'll focus primarily on air, truck, rail, and water modes in the course of this presentation. However, pipelines are an important piece of the freight puzzle. And this freight service spectrum, as sort of outlined by the U.S. Department of Transportation, highlights the difference in levels of service and pricing for each mode. On the left of the spectrum, you will see a greater cost per pound, as well as some greater speed and flexibility in those movements. To the right of the spectrum, very low costs, and typically, as you might expect, the highest weight, lowest value cargo moves in the rail, water, and pipeline modes, while higher value commodities move by air and truck. Give you an idea of what that looks like in the context of the domestic transportation system, our domestic freight network. The artery slide here sort of shows the current freight network by tonnage. Pipelines are not included in this chart. And the densely populated East Coast will continue to see the most challenges with respect to meeting demand in the future because of the limited capacity there. How does freight move in the United States? Based on the Commodity Flow Survey, the U.S. handles a tremendous amount of freight across various modes. In 2007, the U.S. handled $11.8 trillion worth of cargo, as I mentioned before, on modes. You can see primarily that's based on truck shipments. The majority of the tonnage moves by truck, but if you look at ton miles, which is an indication of total system needs, it implies that total freight shipments utilize all shipment modes, as you see a greater reliance, as you see a greater distribution between the truck mode and rail modes. On average, the U.S. is a big country, and there's a tremendous amount of freight that moves along the nation's rivers, railways, airports, and highways. If you look at the graphic here, the shortest move on average is in private truck fleets. Now, these are normally servicing local deliveries such as grocery stores, shipments between facilities, urban delivery type vehicles. Traffic moving on the inland system in the water and shallow draft, part of this agenda, is followed by all trucks and overall distance of movements. The greatest shipment distance by far is in air and parcel, which should come as no surprise, as these much more time sensitive and much more valuable, and are traditionally in very small sizes and smaller shipment lots when compared to other modes. To understand logistics, you already think logistically every time you go to the post office and mail a package. You're typically asked, when will this package arrive and what condition do you want the package to be in when it arrives? That guarantees or insurance that you want to provide, and are you willing to pay more for faster shipment? That's really what logistics is all about. Geography remains critical. Business and services ask those same questions every day. When you think about moving products through markets, time does mean money. There's a tremendous desire to use the transportation system as a way to manage those costs. And I've already mentioned that many of the just-in-time manufacturing processes that we use today use the transportation network as a warehousing alternative. Oftentimes, shippers themselves are removed from transportation decisions. The emergence of 3PLs, which are third-party logistics providers, are essentially one-stop shops that compete for service among many transportation carriers. And if the time sensitivity is such that it requires a different decision, the shipper doesn't necessarily care. It's very it does not matter to them when or where it moves, as long as it gets there at that specified delivery date. Site developers are more focused on access issues in the context of facility location, and understanding from a corridor perspective the accessibility to free flow traffic conditions on an interstate system becomes one of the highest criteria items for site developers. Finally, I want to just come back to the idea that congestion is wasteful. As a cost management strategy, using logistics to remove costs from the system and productivity losses is essential to the decision-making process that a shipper will follow through on. There are concerns to the society, and congestion certainly is wasteful as far as increased emissions and other environmental influences and higher overall costs. So how does that relate really to the delicate nature of what government's involvement is in the movement of freight? And the concerns that I see as the largest ones being the government is essentially being asked if they are to make investments in freight infrastructure to pick winners and losers in this process, which is something that our government, especially from a transportation perspective, we haven't directly influenced those types of decisions in the past. Fair funding allocations, traditionally, governments have provided funding with respect to different regions in a state, or to allay certain concerns that one area, whether it be the rural system or whether it be the urban system, is getting a fair funding allocation. Well, in freight movements, there will be these discrepancies between funding of projects in different areas. Finally, the outside influences that are beyond government's control really alter our decision making as far as which industries to support and which projects might better support those. These outside influences could include everything from shifting business patterns to changes in resources, financial collapse, changes to particular shipping lines policies as far as fuel consumption, choice of ports, and other decisions that go beyond what the typical public sector has been exposed to. Certainly there's some common misunderstandings in the public sector's view of freight. The one that is probably the most dangerous to public infrastructure investment is the concept of if you build it, they will come. There are several examples where we were successful in identifying public investment in a transportation resource. The Erie Canal in 1820 was a visionary idea to connect the upstate New York to the Great Lakes system. It was highly successful. The investment of the Panamanians in the expansion of the Panama Canal and the third set of locks has revolutionized the way that goods will move in our global system. And the original construction of the Panama Canal certainly changed the way that our relationships regarding trade with East Asia and other markets around the world have been important. However, there are numerous cases where there are other intervening factors that have caused tremendous public investment in facilities that haven't been used, and I'll detail a couple of those in future slides. Time horizons are off cycle. Long-term planning in the public sector typically results in 30 to 40 year, 20 to 40 year time horizons, whereas freight stakeholders are trying to meet the next quarter's goals. There is a delicate nature as well on site selection decision making. We try to predict cargo booms. In the Midwest, several freight improvements have been made on changing the dimensions and rules related to movements of oversized and overweight cargoes, such as wind energy. Now, most of the freight coming out of the state of Wisconsin, for instance, is sand going into fracking operations. Now, both wind energy and fracking operations for the extraction of natural gas have emerged over the past several years. And if they're a fad, changing several of the policies and procedures to follow through on these short-term types of cargo could be detrimental in a long-term and not be advantageous in the long term. The other area where there are common misunderstandings is the impact of mergers and acquisitions. As the rail industry, and particularly Canadian railroads, acquired additional railroads around the Chicago area, residents were up in arms as the limited use rail networks that were near those homes and residential areas all of a sudden became major thoroughfares as the railroads acquired them. And the public sector has traditionally done a poor job of understanding how mergers and acquisitions impact the day-to-day operations. I do want to give you an example of some of the areas where there are opportunities for improvements. We already know where many of the bottlenecks are on our freight transportation system. This is ATRI's top 100 bottlenecks based on estimated truck delays. Not surprisingly, the bottlenecks occur most often in our large metropolitan areas where the interstate interchanges exist. One of my favorite things that has been said by many advocates is that we can just move all of the truck freight to eliminate those bottlenecks. We can move truck freight to the rail network. Rail is equally congested and incredibly capital intensive to disentangle. You can see this is the 2035 projections compared to current capacity as far as level of service. There's a lot of red on this chart, which shows the level of service F, which places it above capacity. The northern area of the U.S. is tremendously impacted by soybean movements and other grains, as well as oil sands. Out of North Dakota, the middle part of the United States will be impacted by continuing capacity constraints with the movement of coal. And in the south, much of that projection is based on increased containers coming through the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, even in the context of a Panama Canal expansion. It comes as no surprise then that in the southwestern part of the United States, that in this neck of the woods, where BNSF operates. It comes as no surprise that with this trend and the increased demand and limited capacity, that investors like Warren Buffett look at the railroads as a very good investment, and his investment and ownership of BNSF is reflected in that. The railroads recognize that there are going to be some tremendous capacity constraints. This is a chart of some of the operational improvements that have been made on the railways since the year 2000 to try and alleviate some of that congestion. And I want to talk about two in particular because they relate to the Panama Canal expansion and some changes to the way that goods will move into the middle part of the country. Both CSX and Norfolk Southern have improved their double stack capacity from the East Coast Port of Norfolk, which is the most ready port. It's a deep water port that can take maximum size ships through the Panama Canal, and coming across the mountain range in the Appalachian region, more containerized shipments will end up in Columbus, North Baltimore, in CSX case, and in Columbus at intermodal facilities. I don't want to say that the government has been a bad partner. There are several successful government partnerships. The Alameda Corridor in Long Beach, Los Angeles area, moving containerized traffic off of the surface to a more tunnel effect, has improved not only air quality but reduced congestion in the area as goods move to the Inland Empire. CREATE, which is the Chicago Regional Environment and Transportation Efficiency Program, is a public-private partnership involving the railroads and the governmental agencies, the city of Chicago, the county, the state, and the federal government. Recent improvements to the way that freight projects have competed for federal funds through the Tiger Grant program is another example of successful partnerships. The Port of Tampa has recently improved truck access, or is in the process of building improved truck access lanes, which will remove one of those earlier presented bottleneck areas. Rickenbacker Intermodal Facility is a public-private partnership regarding the base closure of an Air Force facility as it was turned into an intermodal center. And the other example that I wanted to highlight is the Minnesota Freight Advisory Committee, and freight advisory committees will take a larger role later on in the presentation too as a recommended alternative. Multi-state coalitions, including the Mid-America Freight Coalition, the I-95 Corridor Coalition, and here in the southeastern region, the Institute for Trade and Transportation Studies has a multi-state coalition that has been effective at bringing together top-level managers to understand why freight is important as a regional entity. Remember that earlier I noted that the importance of freight movements across jurisdictional boundaries is one of those areas that challenges the current public sector points of view. Connected vehicle technologies and ITS have, and intelligent transportation systems have increasingly been worked at a multi-state level. However, the jury's still out on several of those facilities that the public sector has invested in and or could invest in moving forward. The Chicago Intermodal Facility was a state-of-the-art facility opened just outside of the Port of Chicago. When the facility was opened, there was no tenant, and since then the facility continues to be vacant at tremendous public sector improvement. It was one of those cases where if you build it and they don't come, you have a tremendous waste of resources. The impact of the Keystone Pipeline on our transportation system is yet to be seen. Many of the East Coast ports are considering dredging in anticipation of the expansion of the Panama Canal. And I'd argue that the jury is still out on whether those ports can possibly compete with the ports that already will have tremendous advantage, Charleston, the Port of New York and New Jersey, as well as that Norfolk port, which is already capable of accepting Panamax ships today. In the Midwest, from Missouri through Indiana into Ohio, there's a current federal project looking at along the I-70 corridor, dedicated truck lanes, whether that will actually attract trucks because of their tolling and fee arrangements. Again, I don't see that as the answer. And you'll note that I also have connected vehicle technologies and ITS on this list as well. As the public continues to invest in infrastructure, especially as it relates to freight, weigh and motion devices, advanced information systems, some of these things may not be as effective as we want because the private sector is moving faster than the public sector possibly can. So how do we integrate freight into our decision-making processes in the public sector? I was fortunate in Wisconsin to participate in key top-level efforts by the state that really were focused on outreach to stakeholders and truly understand what freight's role is in that process. Here in Florida, a similar outreach effort is underway, understanding what the business case is and bringing the private sector together with the public sector decision makers. There are ways to integrate freight into planning and design. From a design perspective, one of the earliest examples of that I see as a challenge are we tend to design a project and then throw it over the wall to the operations folks without considering the impact that it might have on a particular freight movement. The example in Wisconsin was the use of roundabouts. As roundabouts became more and more popular as potential traffic congestion alleviating measures, these facilities weren't designed for long trucks and actually were placed on several truck routes without the knowledge of the operations departments. Better understanding multimodal and intermodal moves as those relate to transportation planning and freight-friendly transportation planning. The important consideration of keeping in mind freight needs as the systems are planned out. And I would argue that over the past several years, freight has taken a bigger role in that area. From a national authorization perspective, there will likely be some type of national vision for freight and perhaps resources made available to get over some of those jurisdictional challenges. And I want to spell out a couple of land use opportunities as well. We know that in today's context, what gets measured gets done, and performance measures for freight are an emerging area for many state DOTs in category areas such as safety and security, infrastructure preservation, accessibility to key centers, general mobility for goods and people, and community and environmental sustainability. And each of these areas, as states are adopting performance measures or as local governments are adopting performance measures for their infrastructure system, need to reflect freight. There are several incompatibilities between freight and traditional land use planning. There are conflicts between freight operations and adjacent land uses when residential and commercial areas are placed near high volume freight facilities, whether those be intermodal yards or other switching functions. Schools, hospitals, and other uses that have a high pedestrian focus or have access issues should not typically be located near a high demand freight facility. And this becomes particularly an issue in urban areas as densification of those urban areas occurs. Freight's often considered a nuisance because of congestion and traffic congestion issues. As a train sits across a major arterial during the morning rush hour, there is little that can be done to make people think that freight is a good thing when they're sitting in traffic like that. Noise, vibration, light, pollution and health concerns, as well as the solid infrastructure damage that occurs with heavyweight vehicles moving on perhaps a system that wasn't designed to carry those. There are physical encroachments into freight facilities or interference with freight facilities that happen frequently as the land use is intensified, as apartment complexes or condominiums are developed on port facilities, for instance. And there's certainly safety issues, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, with at-grade crossings near schools or hospitals, as well as trespass on privately owned infrastructure like railways. And certainly accidents and spills become a concern as well. All of that, freight does influence livability. It affects from an access management perspective, which has safety and pedestrian related issues. From an emergency management perspective, the photo here shows chlorine moving on the rail line very near to the U.S. Capitol building. There are certainly transit conflicts in urban environments where urban delivery has to be made and can block transit lanes. Likewise, pedestrian and bicycles can often be impacted by large vehicles, whether it be sight distances or turn-in radii that impact, that it will influence that livability. And from a land use perspective, most of those decisions are made at the local level. And typically, local government will approve specific development proposals that have to reflect a more comprehensive plan. When I was involved in city government in the state of Ohio, I oftentimes made the case that my economic development in the small community that I lived in, which was a suburban community, was at the expense, it was urban sprawl for the surrounding city. And in all honesty, whatever our site plan, whatever our planning process was in place, if we had the opportunity to encourage a different land use with an investor that was ready to spend, we would move on that process because of the economic development potential. So at the local level, if you can influence freight from an access point of view, or at least understand where freight fits into the picture during those decision-making processes, we can make tremendous improvement in the integration of freight. And this slide essentially shows that the state statutes typically do not include freight operations as a required planning element, even if you have a solid planning background. Other critical land use issues, corridor preservation and environmental justice, and I'm unfortunately not going to be able to spend much time describing the environmental justice concerns about goods movement. The impact project is the graphic that is below is from the impact project, which really looked at the issues related to public health and goods movement in the Southern California region. Is an excellent study in how goods movement does impact not only air pollution, land use, climate change, but the environmental justice concerns, as freight facilities are often located in areas that have a disproportionate share of disadvantaged populations. I do want to focus on some recommendations and some takeaways from this, and I'll offer these recommendations in three broad areas that are organizational level support, economic development issues, and overall freight efficiencies. But before I do, we have to address the largest elephant in the room, which is the issue of funding. In order to fund freight projects, freight needs to be integrated into the statewide transportation improvement plan. Without that step, no freight project will be able to receive the attention that it needs in order to be successful. And my recommendation would be that leveraging those partnerships which are developed through that outreach to the stakeholder community is perhaps the best tool that agencies have for improving freight movements and getting projects funded. There are some new mechanisms that will be likely advanced in the next transportation authorization bill, being innovative financing, increased incentives for privatization of freight facilities, enhancements to the Tiger Grant Program, which is a discretionary grant program operated by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And NCFRP Project 29, which was released as Report 15, looks at dedicated revenue mechanisms for freight transportation improvements. And these include fuel tax options, VMT fees, federal registration fees, and other funding sources to focus specifically on improving that national freight transportation network. A state DOT or a local agency needs to have the organizational structure in place to address freight. Multi-state coalitions are a key part at the state level, understanding that freight does not stop at boundaries, and I presented some of the examples of those in the past. I've been fortunate to work in a multi-state coalition before, and if nothing else, it opens the lines of communication. Freight coordinators, establishing a point of contact within an agency that is responsible for freight, can really not only improve the outreach to stakeholders, but also develop a better approach in general to how freight will be handled within the agency. And development of a one-stop shop. Because freight touches on so many different areas within a traditional transportation agency, permitting, planning, and operations need to be included. And without that day-to-day interaction, or at least a format where an external stakeholder can call and be directed with one call to the right place dealing with freight, will really improve the way that the agency can respond to freight-related issues. And as I mentioned before, the involving freight stakeholders using a freight advisory committee is a best case example. From an economic impact and development side, NCFRP 13 has developed a freight facility location guide that outlined the key criteria for site selection. In order for an agency to be truly economic development tool, you have to understand your area's strengths and weaknesses with respect to freight and access, as ability to access key markets or customers and interaction with the transportation network are the top surveyed items with respect to developing freight facilities and relocation. Building upon Tiger's programmatic approach to benefit cost application, understanding the criteria that are in place to pursue that funding, as well as further refinement on those benefit cost calculations. Economic growth typically happens in clusters, and one of the ways that a local government can take advantage of this clustering is in the development of freight villages, where commonly cited businesses related to movement of goods can be co-located to encourage the opportunity for improving freight interactions and consolidations. And finally, to understand economic development issues, it's important to preserve freight corridors in the planning process such that key links are not removed, causing the costs. Freight facilities do change the flow of traffic. They do bring jobs and impact land use development patterns, and may or may not bring development opportunities. They represent desired investment in the community, actively sought by economic developers and planners alike. These facilities, though, are certainly a mixed blessing with both wanted and unwanted consequences. And I'll give you an example from NCFRP 13 that sort of highlighted how you can go about clearly showing what the investment relates to as far as direct and indirect jobs, how much freight volume is projected to be in the facility, and then the transportation impacts as projects are being advanced and new site locations are being made. The last of my recommendation areas is in respect to overall freight movements. I see the public sector, there's a tremendous need to invest in better modeling, need to be proactive and not reactive with respect to understanding freight movements. Establishing freight corridors, especially with respect to superloads or oversized and overweight movements, to move goods efficiently through a state or through a county or through even a regional jurisdiction. better use of and acquisition of data for planning. Certainly the modeling will benefit from better data, but right now the proprietary nature of data that is available makes it cost prohibitive for many agencies to do the modeling necessary. Real-time information investments in some limited advanced traveler information systems for freight can improve the overall efficiency, although I would temper that with a caution that the private sector and the development of new applications are certainly improving information availability, especially to freight carriers. Multi-state coalitions, that opportunity to communicate clearly and communicate and coordinate work programs so that problems are not compounded as you cross state lines is essential. And finally, with respect to technology, I think there is tremendous opportunity for government to begin to crowdsource more information as it relates to freight movements and perhaps get in front of some of the challenges in addressing those bottlenecks. I did take a little bit longer than I had anticipated. I look forward to any questions that might come through and hope that the information wasn't at too high of a level or too low of a level based on that distribution that we had.
Great. Thank you, Jason. That was certainly comprehensive and a lot of material, and I'm sure the questions will start continue to fly in. But in the meantime, I used kind of the moderator's prerogative to kind of start. Actually, the question is, won't the private sector simply adapt to whatever the infrastructure is put into place?
You know, it's one of those classic chicken or egg kind of questions. The private sector, I think in the past, has always viewed the transportation network as a given, and that the transportation infrastructure would be expanded and they wouldn't have to worry about it. As congestion continues to expand, as the rail industry is continued to be looked to as an intermodal source, the government still has this obligation to at least understand that. And the private sector will adapt in that many areas. If the infrastructure improvements aren't made, they will leave. The freight industry by nature is rather nimble. A distribution facility is typically leased rather than owned, so they have an opportunity to move their operations as they see fit. And it's up to the government to be able to, or the governmental entities to be able to address some of that.
All right, we have another question too. Could you expand on how you see crowdsourcing helping current freight needs? What exactly do you mean by crowdsourcing too?
Well, okay. The opportunity, the classic sort of CB radio for truck drivers has been one of those early kind of crowdsourcing opportunities, right? The way it typically worked is a truck driver might communicate where a weigh station has been located or a mobile scale has been located, and truck drivers would respond accordingly. Similarly, not to avoid enforcement opportunities, but also to avoid getting stuck in traffic. As we move to mobile technologies, and there's better information with geographic positioning systems and use of those reliant technologies, there's an opportunity to provide real-time information, real-time routing information based on essentially the truck ahead of you rather than some centralized dispatching service.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Next one is, with site selection being increasingly dependent on tax incentives or quality of life issues and less reliant on end markets and sources of raw materials, won't government continue to be simply reactive in infrastructure development and coordination?
One of the things that's intriguing is I think it's a misnomer that that the tax incentive has been the sole source driving site selection. NCFRP 13 highlighted that the industry was looking for not only qualified workforce, but that transportation access as the critical components, and they'd get around the other tax incentives, and you see that in areas, especially in this time, where different states are competing for business, and even though the tax incentives might have been better in a state, the location decision is made based on the infrastructure that's in place.
Okay, and a final kind of question or open statement for you, Jason, is there, if there's one thing you'd want to leave everybody with today, what would that be?
I think that the understanding that freight has a place at the table in everything that we do is important. Freight impacts transit, freight impacts pedestrian and bicycle safety, freight impacts congestion on the highway system, and I think we've ignored it traditionally, although I would argue also that over the past couple of years we've certainly seen it take a greater importance in state, evidenced by the state of Florida's reorganization to look at freight as a more comprehensive approach as well. So all things freight are good.
Great, thank you, Jason, and thanks for everybody for attending. In a second, I'll open up the evaluation, but I wanted to remind people that who may be AICP members, we will be applying for AICP credits. So if you'd like to get credit for attending today's webcast, please fill out the evaluation and provide your contact information. Even if you do not want the CM credits, we hope you'll take a minute to give us a little bit of feedback about today's webcast. It helps us plan future ones and gives us some ideas of the types of things you'd like to hear about. So again, with that, on behalf of the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida, thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye.